First of the year SED webinar series. This session will be on the overview of BOCES Aid for school districts. I am Jacqueline McAllister, Communications Manager for New York State ASBO, and I want to welcome you all. I do have a few housekeeping things to go over with you. If you have a question throughout the presentation, there's two ways you can ask. You can click Raise My Hand. There's a button where you can hit Raise My Hand and we'll unmute you so you can ask a question if you have one that pertains to something going on in the presentation at that moment. Or you can ask a question in the questions panel and we will read it to the presenter and they can respond. And if we have need any clarification, we'll ask if we can unmute you and have you ask the question yourself. But we will be taking questions throughout the presentation, and I will turn it over to Deborah Cunningham at this time.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Deborah Cunningham. I'm Director of Education and Research for New York State ASBO. Today's topic is BOCES Aid. So why is this important? The State Education Department provides school districts with more than $750 million in BOCES Aid each year for cooperative shared services requested by two or more school districts from BOCES. The BOCES network provides a regional education system that helps especially smaller school districts to provide increased program opportunities for students and cost-effective solutions to many education needs. In today's webinar, SED staff members will present the types of BOCES Aid, an overview of the calculation of BOCES Aid, and the resources available to see BOCES Aid calculations. This webinar will help business office staff maximize BOCES Aid for the provision of critical student services and efficient school district operation. Our two presenters are uniquely qualified to provide this information. Ashley Weil joined the State Aid Office staff in 2013 as an associate accountant. She currently manages all activities related to the data collection, calculations, and technical assistance for BOCES Aid. Prior to joining State Aid, Ashley was a senior auditor for the department's Office of Audit Services. She is a certified fraud examiner and has an MS and BS in accounting. Andrea Hyari joined SED in 1994 and currently serves as the Bureau Chief of the Office of State Aid, STAC, and Medicaid, overseeing all activities related to school district state aid calculations and payments, special education data collection and reimbursement processing, and the school Medicaid program. Now, you may wonder what the path is for someone to become in charge of distributing $20 billion in school aid every year. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Andrea's background. She taught English as a second language. She interned at Questar 3's State Aid Planning Service, and she served as a research associate and director of technology services at the New York State School Boards Association. She holds a PhD in educational administration with a concentration in education finance, and she has an MS in teaching English as a second language and a Bachelor's of Arts degree in psychology and Black and Hispanic studies. So welcome, Ashley and Andrea, and I will turn it over to you. And again, we invite you to ask questions whenever they come up during the presentation. You can raise your hand, as Jacqueline mentioned, and speak your question, or you can type it in and we will handle it. So thank you for attending, and Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this webinar with an overview of BOCES Aid. In the department, I only work with the BOCES, so that's just what I do. So in this webinar today, this is what we're going to go over. We're going to overview the types of BOCES aids that exist, the data collection for calculating BOCES aids, also the payment of of BOCES Aid. Then we're going to get into a much more detailed discussion of the BOCES service aid, the admin aid. We'll also go over the rent aid and the capital aid. So the 4 types of BOCES aid are service aid, which for the current 2014-15 aid is based on your 2013-14 expense. There's also administrative aid, which again is based on your 13-14 expense. However, with rent aid and capital aid, the other 2 aids, it's actually current year expense. So the 14-15 aid is based on your 14-15 expense. So you're receiving aid on 2 years. Your service aid is actually going to be primarily your largest aid that you will receive from the BOCES. It's for the purchase of services that you've contracted with the BOCES for, and it's according to your specific participation level in a specific service. So if you purchase more of it, then your aid will be higher than a district who purchases less. Your administrative aid is for the BOCES non-service operating expenses. Excuse me, I'm fighting a little cold. Regardless of the district service level of participation, it's allocated among all the components of the BOCES. Rent aid is for the BOCES lease expenditures for both instructional and administrative spaces. And this, again, is allocated among all the components of the BOCES. Then we have capital aid, which is for the district share of approved BOCES expenses for capital construction projects, which, again, are allocated among all the components of the BOCES. So for the data collecting of BOCES aid, we have the expense data, which is all the expenses at the BOCES level. And what we do is we collect all the district's BOCES aid reported to SED via the SAM system. So it's on the same system that the school districts use. And for, well, so you're a member of a particular BOCES. That's your home BOCES, and they will even report expense data for services that are purchased from other BOCES that services are provided for. So what we use for calculating the aid ratios is the average daily attendance and the tax levy data, which is reported to SED by the school district. So that's how we collect the information for the aid ratio. All 4 types of aid are calculated on an aidable expense for each component district using that district's aid ratio. So everything for your particular district is based on your particular aid ratio and the amount of service that you purchase. The BOCES aid is always paid directly to the BOCES, and the BOCES are a pass-through institution, so it uses the SED reports to determine how much aid is due to each of their components. BOCES aid is paid on a different schedule than school district aid. The first payment is in February, then there's one in June, and the last one for the year is in September. So, so the total BOCES aid in February and June are can be based on two different numbers. It's the lesser of the 2014-15 calculated aid, which would be the actual expenditures, or the projected aid from the previous year. It depends on which one's less. So if your actual expenditures for last year are less, that's what we pay on. However, if your projected is less, that's what we use for the February and June, and then any excess is paid in September. Because it's a cash flow mechanism for the state so that we know approximately how much we're spending. So that's why we'd like to have the good projections for the next school year. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Andrea she's going to be going over the service aid portion of the presentation.
Before you do that, this is Deborah Cunningham. Can I just ask a question? So you said all of the aid for those four categories goes to the BOCES.
Yeah.
And then the BOCES then sends that aid to the districts, and then separately they charge the districts for the services, or just can you go over that a little bit more?
Well, what we do is the check is paid to the BOCES in one huge lump sum. Mm-hmm. And the BOCES, what they then do is they break it up among their components so that all the districts get the correct amount. And then they're supposed to pass it through to the school districts. So they're supposed to send the money to the school districts.
Right, because their flow through, then it goes to the district, and then the district pays the BOCES for the services that they get. Right?
I think the best way to answer that is that we don't really handle anything to do with the billing process. We don't know when the BOCES bill the districts for their services, but I don't think there's a time-wise, a linear connection necessarily between we pay the aid and it goes to the districts and then they get billed. I think there's a billing process within each BOCES and
right. And I didn't mean to imply that. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. This is Andrea. So I'm going to talk about the calculation of your BOCES service aid, which is the biggest chunk of BOCES aid, and it's the one that's most directly related to what the school district actually needs and purchases from the BOCES. I'm going to remind you here that we're talking about the steps in a data reporting and calculation process that we do up here in Albany, and it's not necessarily reflective of your BOCES internal processing. So if I say something like the BOCES allocates this, what I'm really saying is they're reporting to us an allocation for your district. How they actually do that internally in relation to your participation level in certain services is the real world. We're talking here just about a calculation process. So, you know, if you have questions about the internal process in the BOCES, you're probably going to need to speak with them. So this is a fairly complicated process, the servicing. I'm going to try and break it out into 4 steps. One of those steps, the first one, actually happens at the BOCES level. And then there's kind of a devolution to the districts, and the rest of the calculation happens at the district level. And we're going to go through the 4 steps in detail, but here they are, they're listed out, and we'll go through them here first and then go into each one in more detail. So the BOCES have a total expense for each service that they provide and that you purchase, and that total expense needs to be reduced by a bunch of required, statutorily required, and logically required BOCES level deductions in order to arrive at an expense, an aidable expense at the BOCES level that they can then allocate across the districts that are participating in a particular service. So we're going to be talking really here at the individual service level, and we'll actually go through an example later on. After these BOCES level deductions are made, the BOCES allocates what's remaining as an aidable expense at the BOCES level for each service across all the components participating in that service in proportion to each district's participation level. That expense that's allocated to your district, your piece of that expense, is then further reduced by certain deductions at the component level to arrive at a final aidable component expense for your aid. And when we talk about component level deductions, the difference between the BOCES level and the component level deductions is that the component level deductions are specific to your participation level in the service. That's why they have to be done at each individual district level and not at the BOCES level. And then finally, the simplest part, we take the final aidable expense for your district for a service and apply to it the BOCES service aid ratio. That's just the overview. Now let's drill down a little bit. Okay, here's our example. We're going to talk about a career education service called General Occupational Education. It's got a PSN number of 101. I don't know if anybody's heard that term PSN. It's what the BOCES use to identify every service that they keep a record of at the BOCES. It's really, I'm going to be using it interchangeably with the word service, individual service. So the BOCES have an SA 111, and that's the equivalent, an annual financial statement, which is the equivalent of your ST3. Not the same document, but exactly the same purpose and role. It's an OSC reporting document. And for this PSN 101, they have, let's say, reported that their total expense, the BOCES total expense for providing that service to all the components was $5.7 million in the base year, in the prior year. That includes in all the kind of account codes that you're used to seeing on, like on your ST3, salary, equipment, supplies and materials, etc. That's total expense. We're still on step 1. We're still getting to calculate this BOCES level aidable expense. But the BOCES can't allocate that entire $5.7 million that it costs them to provide the service. They can't allocate that total amount across all the components that are participating. Why not? Because there's a lot of revenue, well, not a lot, but several revenue and expenditure items associated with providing that service that really shouldn't generate BOCES aid for you. These BOCES level deductions are subtracted from the total BOCES expense of $5.7 million to arrive at a total aidable BOCES expense that they then can allocate across the participating components of the home BOCES. So still on step one, and here's what it looks like in a slightly modified version of one of our reports. This top section shows you, looks like ST3 codes, their SA111 codes, what their total expense is for this service. Here's your $5.7 million, and here's the breakdown of the $5.7 million. Down below, we have a few of the more common types of BOCES level deductions that logically need to come out of that total expense that shouldn't generate aid. One of them is this expense that's allocated to other BOCES or non-components. So we calculate BOCES aid for the component belonging to every BOCES, but as you probably know, when a BOCES provides a service, districts from other BOCES, other home BOCES, can purchase that service through the BOCES. But they're going to claim the BOCES, let's say this is what we're looking at here is BOCES A. If BOCES B purchases some of this career ed service that we're looking at here, they're going to claim that expense that they're making on behalf of their districts that are purchasing it from BOCES A. They're going to claim aid on that. So we here need to deduct any expense associated with this service that's generated by non-component districts. Or sometimes the BOCES themselves purchase materials and services from another BOCES, and that expense portion of this service that we want to aid also needs to come out. The next one down, if a district, if a BOCES is receiving any other state or federal money in the form of grants, etc., that might be supporting the provision of this service, then to avoid double dipping, that also needs to come out of the expense. It also shouldn't be aided. If they sell certain material and equipment and receive revenue from that, that's also a deduct. And then just like you have a miscellaneous revenue, there's a miscellaneous 2770 miscellaneous revenue for the BOCES as well. We don't know what's in it. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small, but we deduct that also. So with revenue that would be supporting the expense from this service and therefore should not be in what we're going to try to arrive at a total aidable expense. So the bottom line here, we're taking our total expense that it costs the BOCES to provide the service, taking out what these are called our BOCES level deductions, and arriving at this $5.4 million at the bottom here, which then can be allocated across the participating components of the service. And you'll notice here, we, just like with you guys with the districts, we collect projected information as well and go through the entire process on the projected side as well. We're going to be focusing here more on the aid side, but we do all of this for projections as well. Okay. So now we've got a total BOCES level expense that's aidable. The BOCES is allocating that across participating components in proportion to participation levels. The cost basis, what can determine the participation level, can vary across services. Sometimes it's a flat fee for an annual service. Sometimes it's a per pupil amount, which would vary for the district cost depending on how many pupils were participating. That's what we mean by cost basis, and the BOCES determines how to allocate that total aidable expense across the components based on participation. We don't have any involvement in that step. For every service provided, BOCES reports to us an allocated expense amount for every participating component in the home BOCES. Again, only for the districts that actually belong to the BOCES. Okay. So let's say, for purposes of our example here, continuing with our example, let's say that in this example, the BOCES allocated to component district A this amount, this portion of the $5.4 million total expense for allocation, $740,000. Here again, District A can't receive aid on the entire $740,000 that it's been allocated. Why not? Well, we have a whole other series of potential deductions that can reduce the aidable expense for District A for this service. These we're calling component level deductions. And these deductions, just like the parallel example with the BOCES, are subtracted from the $740,000 aidable expense, allocated aidable expense, to arrive at a total aidable component expense. Bottom line is your service aid is based on 5 or fewer, if you don't have some of the deductions, maximum 5 data items for each component for each service that are reported to SED by your BOCES. So we're at step 3 now, where we're going to start looking at what comes out of that allocated aidable expense and actually drives the final aid amount that you receive. So the next slide, I'm going to show you a section of a published SED report, which you can access. It's a fairly new report, which you can access via the State Aid homepage, the same place you access the rest of your State Aid output reports. It's actually the last output report on the long list, now very long list of output reports that you can access via the web, and it's called the Component Aid Report by PSN, meaning by individual service. So you can actually see for every service that you purchase from your BOCES, you can see, run this report. It takes a little while, especially if you're purchasing a lot. You can actually see the aidable expense, deductions, and aid for every single service that you purchase. And you can see it for the actual and the projected year, except that just like with your output reports for the districts, we don't actually calculate aid for the projected year. We only show you the aidable expense. So let's take a look at that, and we're going to spend some time here. Any questions so far? Okay.
So far, so good.
All righty. So again, I'm just going to remind you, because it doesn't say it right on here, but we're talking here at the district level. This is all district data, District A's data. And this is, what's on this report here is really the crux of your BOCES aid, how you get your BOCES aid. We're going to look at actually 3 separate examples of service aid calculations, just because they each have a twist, or a main one, and then 2 that have a twist to them. And we'll be looking at this one up here first. Let's just go across. Here's your PSN number. This is the number that your BOCES, that this BOCES is assigning to this particular career education service. The next one is what we call a state activity code. I'm not going to spend too much time on the coding, but the PSN can be assigned by each BOCES, meaning 101 in BOCES A might mean something slightly different than 101 in BOCES B, One, it might be general career ed, and another BOCES 101 might be summer career ed. But the state activity code 3000, this 4-digit code, is something that's standardized across the state. So this is the standard activity name. The BOCES may name the service something else associated with that PSN, but these two here are standardized across the state, meaning that 37 BOCES might offer slightly different flavors of this service, but they all have certain standards and certain criteria associated with the service, and those are standardized, and that's the standard code, and that's the standard name. And we're going to skip this stuff here. We're going to, the provider BOCES and the PSN, we're going to talk about that in the next example. The report shows the current year aid ratio, and here's our 740,000 that we were looking at before. The allocated expense after BOCES level deductions. And now we're going to take a look at what these deductions are that come off your aidable expense, the component level deductions. First one is something called a refund of prior year expense. It's an account code. You're familiar with it from your own accounting. But in BOCES land, it means a little something more. It means that if you spent this money with the BOCES in a past year, we aided you on it already. It was an aidable expense from some prior year. The BOCES is now telling us that they gave you this refund, and we need now to deduct it from your aidable expense so that we can get back the aid we paid on it. You got your portion back. We need to take our portion back. That's what the refund of prior year deduct is. And again, the BOCES gives us all this information. And you can see, you can think about it and understand how, like I said before, all these deductions are component and service specific. That's why they can't be done at the BOCES level. This is based on your participation in this service in a prior year. The next one is excess salaries. This is the biggest, usually the biggest and also most prevalent deduction. Excess salaries for this BOCES. You may know that BOCES aid is only paid on BOCES salaries up to $30,000. Any salary amount that the BOCES pays to anyone over $30,000 becomes a deduction from your aidable expense. And the BOCES provide this allocation to us, but they actually also provide every single employee, a list of every single employee that's associated with every single service, which service, what their salary is, and whether they're part-time, full-time, and additional information. So a lot goes into this calculation, and it's a deduction. It represents, for your district participation level, for this particular service, all of the aggregated salaries for that people working in that service that were in excess of $30,000. We're going to skip this other BOCES for a second and look here. We're going to move to this unapproved service expense. Unapproved service expense can be many different things. We have something that we call a never aidable service, which you know that none of the special education services that you purchase from BOCES receive BOCES aid. None of your transportation services, if you purchase them from BOCES, are aided because those are both aided in other areas of our system. So those are never aidable services. That's not what this is. What this is, it represents certain restrictions on certain services. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Certain restrictions on certain services. There may be, let's say we're looking at the career education service. There may be some adults that the BOCES lets participate in this service. We don't aid that. So any expense for adults from your district that are attending that service would have to come out as an unapproved service. One example we like to use all the time is many of you purchase a textbook coordination service. It has a lot of service aspects to it, but it also includes the BOCES actually purchasing the textbooks on your behalf. Your actual expense for those textbooks when you pay the BOCES for that service is not BOCES aidable because you're getting textbook aid in it elsewhere in our system. So those are examples of what we're calling unapproved service expense. We don't really know. We know it's by service. We get this number by service that the BOCES reports to us, but we don't really know exactly what the restriction is in that particular service in that particular year for your particular district. Then we move on to, we're going to skip this other BOCES. We'll talk about that a little bit later. This other miscellaneous deduction item here. That can be also many different things, but primarily, I'm going to say hopefully, each year your BOCES should be approaching you at the beginning of the year and asking a question, something like, either by form or however they communicate it, they ask a question, are you receiving any funds? Are there any other grant funds or anything else that you are using to support the purchase of this service that we should be deducting, because if we don't deduct it, you're receiving aid twice? An example of this right now, not for this particular service most likely, but an example that I can give you right now is you should have been asked by your BOCES this year whether, if you're purchasing technology services from the BOCES, whether you received any Microsoft settlement funds and used those funds to support the purchases with the BOCES. If you did, that would be reported to us as a miscellaneous deduction from your BOCES aidable expense, not from a career ed COSR, but from a particular technology COSR, because the instructions for that Microsoft settlement school technology voucher program are that it's supposed to supplement and not supplant forms of aid that you're already getting. So we see here on the end here, we're looking at 2 years worth of data. This is the aid year. This is the expense year, but we're looking at data for 14-15 aid. And just like the other example, we're taking our allocated expense minus this, minus this, minus this, minus this, which leaves us with the 558, which gets multiplied by the 0.77, and leaves you with $432,000 in BOCES aid for this service. I will take a breath. And you'll notice down here where I've got these X's, that's because this is projected data, and we don't calculate aid for the projections, but we do calculate aidable expense. So this example here we went through has essentially all kind of faked it up to have all of the potential deductions, so we could talk about them. The point of this next example here is to talk a little bit about how aid is calculated when you have purchased a service that's really offered by other than your home BOCES, but the way that's handled is your home BOCES contracts with the other BOCES and keeps the record of the service themselves. So your BOCES keeps the record. You're purchasing. I actually don't really know how it looks from your end. Whether you deal, I think you deal with your home BOCES in those instances. But what we've got here is this PSN, this number is your BOCES, how it's keeping the record of the service, but I've given an example here where it's a service that District A has purchased from, is offered by and has purchased from another BOCES. But again, you need to get the aid because you're ultimately spending the money. So your home BOCES has to keep the record, give us the reporting, give us the data so that we can calculate aid for that type of arrangement. So here's your, on this report, if you look at it when you go to the web, you'll need to know that this is your, how your BOCES is keeping track of it. This is the state activity. This is the activity name. So both the purchasing BOCES and the providing BOCES have this record keeping in common, which allows us to maintain and manipulate all this stuff. But this is what your BOCES is calling that service, how it's coding it. Then we move to this column, which you see is blank here because this is a service that's provided by your home BOCES. But now we're looking at a service that's actually provided by some other BOCES. We don't have the BOCES name here, but this is the BEDS code of that BOCES. And this 317, that's the service number that BOCES B, the providing BOCES, happens to have numbered the same service. That's why I said earlier, these numbers are BOCES specific. This information is standardized statewide. So we do a lot of crosswalking and probably the most complicated aspect of our relatively new BOCES SAM system, but we need to know, in order to calculate aid correctly, we need the BOCES, your home BOCES, to tell us, okay, this is not a service I provide. This was purchased from this BOCES, and here's the information. We need to distinguish between provided and purchased, what we call provided and purchased services. The aid ratio is the same, obviously, because it's still District A that has purchased the service and is making the expense for the service. And here's the allocated expense. Typically, the way this will show up on your home BOCES record is as what we call a 0.490 contract expense, which, let's say you're the only district that has purchased this service from the other BOCES. This allocated expense may well represent your actual expense. In other words, it doesn't have to go through all that big deduction, BOCES level deduction process that we did to get to this number. You know, this may be just District A purchased this service from this BOCES. Your BOCES is keeping track of it. Here's what it costs. I mean, didn't really cost your BOCES anything. Here's what you paid for it. Here's the allocated expense. There might be a refund of prior year expense for a purchased service, but it's unlikely because that information would have to be provided to your BOCES by the provider BOCES in order for your BOCES to report it to us, and it's not that common. It is common, however, for there still to be excess salary deduction necessary for this purchase from a different BOCES. And that's why we have two columns here. If you ever look at this report and you see excess salary deduction in both this BOCES and other BOCES columns, then you need to give us a call because something's wrong. You're either purchasing it from your own BOCES or you're purchasing it from somewhere else, but it shouldn't be both of them, and that's why we have the two columns. So this number here, it represents the same thing as it did up here, except that we need to know that it's from the other BOCES. And in fact, BOCES B, that's providing this guidance service you've purchased, actually has to tell in the beginning of the school year your BOCES what this number is, because and then your BOCES reports it to us so we can make this deduct. And the reason for that, even though mechanically, computer-wise and mechanically, it would be a heck of a lot easier for the BOCES that's providing this service, the other BOCES, not your home BOCES, to give us this number so we can do the deduct, as opposed to telling your BOCES and having your BOCES tell us. Is we decided when we created this new software a few years ago that we were not comfortable having another BOCES other than your home BOCES report data that affected your district's aid. So we only collect that data from your home BOCES, even though it's really a number that's based on the salaries and the excess salaries of the employees of the other, what we call the other BOCES. Hard to do this not standing in front of people, because this is the point where I would assume I may have some glazed over expressions, because it is kind of complicated. But that's the cross-contract process. When you look at this report, when you see things in this column instead of this column, and when you see this information here, it means that it's a cross-contracted service. But the process is the same. So we have an allocated expense minus this, minus this, minus this. There is no this, there is no this. In this particular instance, there could be unapproved service that the providing BOCES reports is associated with the service. We do collect that. I just didn't stick one in there now. But because you see the two columns there, we do collect it. There could be a number there. There could be this. And here's your final aidable expense multiplied by the same aid ratio, because it's still your district that's getting the aid based on your aid ratio, and that's the aid. Okay. One more little example here, just because, why not? You may look at this report, and you may see that you're getting negative aid. In most cases throughout our system, if there's a negative showing up in aid, we've done something wrong, because it shouldn't be less than 0 in most cases. How can you possibly have aid taken away? In this particular case, it's possible. In the case of BOCES aid, it's actually possible. The most common reason it's possible is that you stopped purchasing a service this year that you purchased in a prior year and got a refund for. See where this is showing up, this $10,000? And as I described before, we take back our piece of this refund that you got because we think we aided it already. But if you're not purchasing the service, if you didn't purchase the service last year, then there's no allocated expense. There's no nothing except this refund that you got. But we still want our money back. So we're going to apply your aid ratio to it and take it out of your total BOCES service aid for this year. Doesn't happen that often, but it happens. So this, again, as I said, is an actual report on the web. It's a greatly reduced version, because if you actually run the report, it will be quite long because it's going to represent every service that you purchase. I think there's an option to actually only look at the actual year one at a time instead of getting these 2 lines. That makes it a little bit shorter. But and then at the bottom of the very bottom of the report, you'll see this information. It gives you the total aidable expense for the current year. The report currently excludes admin and capital because those are not services, and we display that information on a different report, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. So this is your total aidable service, total aidable projected year service, the difference between the two, and the percentage change. And finally, your total, not your total BOCES aid, just your total current year aid on services for the prior year. Here's a summary. This is allocated aidable. That was the $740,000 we started with, minus the refund, minus excess salary, minus unapproved services, minus miscellaneous deductions, and that gives your final component, what we call a component aidable service expense. And then comes the simple.
Deborah, I have a question.
Okay.
That refund of prior year expense, I'm struggling a little bit with those words, just exactly what it means. Is that essentially where the state overpaid aid, and so then they're taking back that?
That's actually a good question. No. It's when the BOCES actually decides that the BOCES overcharged the district for the service in a prior year. Maybe they started out with X number of kids, but partway through, and they paid all their bill, but then partway through the year, a few kids dropped out, and so the final cost was lower. I'm just
yes, yeah, all right, that's really helpful.
That I don't know what BOCES does, but it's actually when the BOCES pays too much, and then, but because they paid too much in a prior year, we didn't know that when they claimed it, so we paid aid on it in the prior year. So right. The BOCES is telling us, BOCES is telling us we gave this back to this district. This is their share of a refund, or maybe it's only this district getting a refund for whatever reason. We refunded this amount. They're telling us we refunded this amount to this district. And we're like, okay, that's cool, but we most likely paid service aid on it whenever you claimed it in the past before you realized it was an overcharge.
Yeah.
So
all right, that's much clearer for me. I don't know if that fits anyone else up, but it's really helpful. It's the BOCES refund.
Yeah, the district really should only get 77.4% of that $15,000. We should get the rest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Not to open a can of worms, but this is an area where several of the BOCES reported their EBALA refunds that they had to make to the districts. And in many cases, we did aid that amount in the past, and this was one of the options for how the state would recoup its portion of the EBALA refund, is the district, the BOCES could report it to us in this area. Okay, this is the easy part. We take the final component aidable service expense, which in this case was the $558,000. Multiply that by the aid ratio, and that's the BOCES service aid. This is an excerpt from a different component output report that Ashley will be talking about in a few minutes. It's a report very similar to the one that we've been looking at, except it's not by service, individual service. It's aggregated into service areas. And Ashley will be talking about that, but at the top of that report, that's where you can see that different report. That's where you can see the calculation of your aid ratio. And that's why I'm showing it to you here. So we got to our final step, which is aidable expense times the aid ratio. And should you want to actually walk through the calculation, I'm not going to spend time on it here. It's fairly straightforward. It's a selection process, and you can look at that by yourself. And that's step 4, where we actually apply the aid ratio to the component aidable expense. Again, that calculation is not, that I just showed you up here, is not available on the component aid report by PSN. And that detailed calculation is displayed on a different report. And the data on that report is by service area. I'm going to, unless there's some questions on that part, I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley, who will talk a little bit more about this service area level component report, and also follow up with some information on admin, rent, and capital, not in as much detail as we talked about the service, but that's where we'll go next. I'll just wait a second to see if there's any questions. Okay. Thank you very much. Nice talking to you.
I think we're good to move on.
If you digest and have questions, feel free to give me a call later on. Bye-bye.
Hello again. So I'm going to be talking about the other report, which is the service area level component aid report. And what it does is it does display all of the 4 types of BOCES aid, where the PSN level report will only show your service aid. So it displays here admin aid calculation, an aggregate of your service aid by major service areas, which we're going to go over on the next slide. Also, it will show your capital and rent, and it shows a summary of your expense and aid information on the bottom. So all BOCES service belong in one of 9 service areas. The service area level component is in 9. So for example, all types of career ed services, it'll always be in the 100 level area. The 200 level area is special education, which are not BOCES aidable, but we still collect all the same information for the special education services as we do for the other one for the BOCES reporting, but it is not displayed in the report. So then we have the 300 levels, which are your itinerant services, the 400A, which are summer schools, 400B are other general instruction, 500A is technology, 500B is staff development, 500C is other instructional support, and the 600s are other services that are non-instructional. So for the admin aid, it's calculated very similar to the service aid. So the BOCES reports the total administrative expense for everybody on the SA 111, and then it's reduced by the same BOCES level deduction for the total aidable amount that's allocated across components. the BOCES then allocates the resulting aidable expense proportionally across all of its components and reports the allocated amounts to us via the SAM system. So the expense allocated to each component is then further reduced by the component level deduction to arrive at the final aidable component admin expense, which is then multiplied by the aid ratio. And this is the same aid ratio as the service expense. So we do an administrative aid calculation expenditure check, which is the main difference between admin aid and service aid. The amount of admin expense for the BOCES in excess of 10% of the BOCES total expense is calculated. The reason we do this is it's an actual statute. Excuse me. And what we compare that to is we take the greater of the excess of the 10%, if there is any, and we compare it to the total excess salaries in the admin area. And whichever one is higher, that's what we use for the selected admin deduction. The BOCES then allocates this deduct proportionally among all of the component districts again. Each district's share is then deducted from the district's allocated expense when calculating its final admin aid. And the BOCES reports each component share of the selected administrative deduction. And we'll see an example of that a little later. So the allocated admin expense minus the refund for prior year, if there is any, minus any miscellaneous or unapproved admin expenses, and then the selected admin deduction equals the component aidable administrative expense. So here's our example. So we do receive the projected figures as we do with the service level deduction, as we do with the service area. However, we don't calculate any projected aid. So in this example, we have the admin expense allocated to this component is $162,000. Refund for prior years is $19,000. There's no unapproved admin expense. And then the selected admin for this deduction for this BOCES is $41,000. So we have an aidable expense of $102,000, which we multiply by the sharing ratio. District. Sorry. So then we multiply it by the district aid ratio, and that's how we get the administrative aid payable to this component. Now for rent is reimbursed for each component for both instructional and administrative stays. The BOCES will, of course, report the total amount of rent expense for each component district, and the allocated, and the BOCES will allocate the rent based on their own particular formulas. The allocated rent expense for the component is then multiplied by the district's RWADA aid ratio. This, for rent in capital, it will always be your WADA aid ratio. It will never be anything else as things stand now. Aid is paid on current year rent expense, so for 14-15 aid, it is the 14-15 expense. During the year, the BOCES are required to substantiate the allocation of rent expense on a form which we call the SA-116A form. It provides the individual lease expense and along with other information. The BOCES also must submit a SAM's revision if the rent expense changes throughout the year. So, now for capital aid, capital aid is reimbursed for each component share of the BOCES approved capital construction expenses. So what happens is the BOCES capital projects must be approved by facilities planning, exactly the same as the districts. Most capital reporting that the BOCES do are an SA-139, a final cost report, and if any other forms are required, they do send them, which is the same as for the districts. Districts are aided on their current year expense for BOCES projects, and or if there are any debt service payments if the district issued debt to fund its share of the project. So, what the BOCES initially report a single current year allocated expense to SED via SAMs for each component. Then the allocated capital expense again is multiplied by the district's or WADA aid ratio. During the year, what the BOCES send to us is what we call the SA-109, and it contains project-based allocation in detailed debt service information by district if there is debt service. Again, BOCES must submit any SAM's revisions if the capital expenses change throughout the year. So, anybody have any questions?
Yes, we have one from Colleen Lifferner. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. One of them was, what is an example of an unapproved administrative expense on one of the previous slides?
Okay, so
Hi, this is Andrea. We don't really have an answer. It's kind of a legacy item. I think that one BOCES has reported $40,000 in that item in the past X number of years, but when we redesigned the system from the DEA to SAMS, we kind of just left it there. There is nothing official that goes there. So, and it's not used very often, which I'm pretty sure it must have zeros anytime.
Yeah.
Yeah. I probably should have blotted that one out, like I did some of the other stuff that is not used very much. But I don't like to say trust me very often, but trust me, you don't need to be concerned about it. Unless you see something there for your own district, then I would question your BOCES and ask what it is. But generally speaking, it's not used very much and doesn't represent anything standardized that we can talk about.
Okay, she said thank you. Our next question is, where is PSN level report located?
it's with your state aid output reports right on the website, right on the state aid website. And it's by district, so you have to enter your particular BEDS code or district name. and it's all the way at the bottom. So it's the very last one.
In case there's a mixture of districts, I mean, these days district output reports can be accessed via SAMS or online, and we don't really know who uses online and who goes through SAMS. So I can tell you that this report, this BOCES report, it's generated out of the BOCES SAMS system, so districts can't find it inside their own SAMS system. You have to go online to see it. In case there's folks who have never or seldom accessed their own output reports online, you need to go to the State Aid homepage. We can send exact instructions onto Deborah to display. But you basically get to the homepage. There's a little white box on the top left of the homepage. You put in either your district name or your district code. You will then see a URL with your district on it. You click on that. You scroll down until you see something that says something like access reports from the SAMS page or something like that. You click on that. It's a little bit of a circular process because we're still currently straddling SAMS and the mainframe for prior years. So you'll again have to enter your, after you click on that link to the SAMS reports, you'll have to enter your district or district code again and submit, and then you'll see a long list of your district output reports. And the last one on the list is the PSN level component aid report. It may not say PSN. I don't know if it says PSN on the name. It may be to say component school aid report or something like that, but it's the last one on the list. A few items, a few reports above that, you'll see a link for the component aid report, and that's the service area level report, and also an EST version of that report. So there's 3 component aid reports out there. The last one on the list is the service level one that I was talking about earlier.
Okay, thank you. Another question, this may be duplicative. Where can service area level component aid report?
That's on the same page.
Okay. The next question is, if my BOCES aid ratio continues to decrease every year, what should I look for to find out the reason for the decrease?
That's a good question. One of the slides that I showed, one of the last slides that I showed, maybe Ashley can get to it, was the calculation of your BOCES aid ratio, and that is at the top of the service area level report. It's kind of hard with the webinar. You can't really show whole reports, but that's the top section of the service area level report. That report is available to you for multiple years. So all you need to do is call up that report. I think we have seven or 8 years worth of that report out on the web. Line them up. It hasn't changed much, if at all, over the years. Line it up, and you can see what's happening. So if your aid ratio is decreasing, it means that your full value per Arwada, most likely, as compared to the state average, is increasing. You're looking wealthier compared to the state average if your aid ratio is going down. So you can look at your full value and see if it's increasing. You can look at your pupil, your Arwada, to see if it's decreasing. You know, and it's kind of an interaction there. If they're both happening, then there's your explanation. If one is happening, you know, it can be, one can exacerbate the other or mitigate the other, the pupils or the full value. But generally speaking, that's the answer. If you happen to Now this millage, what we call a millage ratio selection, is a little more complicated, but the general principle is if you line those up, put them in a spreadsheet even, those are your factors, and that's what will, if you choose to spend time on it, that will be clear. It'll be clear what's happening.
And this is Deborah Cunningham. It is because of the comparison with the state average, you could look more wealthy because another part of the state is actually looking poorer. Even though things may not have changed in your district wealth-wise, your relationship to the state average could change. So sometimes you don't realize what's going on in the whole state affects your aid ratio.
And that, if you notice that on item 4 of this slide, this 677,000, that is the state average. So if you look at this report for multiple years, you can also see how that number is changing.
Okay, we have 2 more questions as none more come in, but I have a question from Michelle Levings from the Questar 3 State Aid Planning Office. The question is the
we don't take questions from I'm just kidding.
Is the administrative expenditure check the same thing as the 10% admin cap? If so, it was our understanding that the 10% admin cap was going away. Thank you. Do you need me to repeat any of that?
No, just give me a minute to.
Okay.
Yes, it's the same thing. No, it didn't go away. We made a minor modification in the way it's calculated to address the fact, to address the dramatically increasing employee benefits, increases, medical,
the post-employment employee benefits.
The dramatic increase in post-employment benefit, post-employment
benefits.
So we tweaked the calculation a little bit so that certain BOCES that were so that the inclusion of those post-employment benefits in admin expense would not make certain BOCES hit the cap as quickly. So we tweaked the calculation, but it did not go away. It's still in statute. It's still on our admin. We have a separate, a separate output report that is not public at this time. It hasn't been public since we switched to SAMS, that calculates that check. It's still there. It's still, the calculation is displayed. It's just been tweaked slightly. And if Shelley wants to give either Ashley or me a call, we can show her how to access the report through both her own BOCES SAMS, and she can see how the calculation has changed.
Okay, one more question. Is there any relief for districts that have large pilots that go on and off the tax rolls that make us look wealthier?
I think there's 2 pieces to the answer. I'm not sure if one would apply, and one is that the calculation of the tax levy that shows up at item 7, that's calculated actually in the district. What report shows it? I don't know if we just I can't remember if we display that calculation, but it's not a straight tax levy. And I believe that that tax levy makes adjustments for certain districts for certain pilots. The 485, I think it's just the nuclear plant pilots. Again, I'm sorry I don't have a very detailed answer off the top of my head. Whoever's asking can give me a call and we can talk more about it. So that's one. I'm not sure what district it is, but for certain districts there are certain adjustments built into that tax levy that you don't see on this report.
She says she's Nancy Squires from Oswego.
Yeah, that's one of the districts. I think that's helpful. I think that Oswego has a 485B pilot and that it is taken into consideration. But if she wants to pursue it, she should give me a call, and I need time to go see where that tax levy calculation is in our system so I can show it to her. If she wants to send me an email, or we can just set up a couple of minutes to chat about it.
Okay. I hope that helps. She said thank you. Do we have any more questions?
This is Deborah Cunningham, and I have a question about what is the rationale underlying providing current year aid for BOCES rent and BOCES capital expense. I know a number of districts would be very interested in current year aid for expenses of new high-cost students with disabilities that move into the district mid-year, and also we've seen the need for having current year growth aid that like we used to have in the past, this past year. So I'm just curious what the logic was for providing current year aid for those two items.
I don't have an answer off the top of my head. It's nothing. It's been around as long as I've been around, and I've been around a long time.
Okay. All right.
I think we used to pay districts building aid on their actual debt service, and when we did that, we paid aid on a current basis. We paid regular building aid to districts on a current year basis when we were aiding their actual debt service. So it may have something to do with the fact in that when there's a large capital, BOCES capital project, the districts sometimes issue debt in order to ante their share to the BOCES instead of paying cash, and then they have a debt service schedule. So the current year, which may be level and may not be level. So paying on a current year, especially if we know we did it in the past with districts, it may have to do with the fact that it's an attempt to reimburse the districts in line with their actual annual expenditures. Not that you couldn't apply that logic to anything else that we pay on a base year, but that's all I can think of off the top of my head.
But essentially there's a historical precedent that has been continued.
I would say it's a historical precedent only in relation to debt.
Yes.
I can't. I'm trying to remember if when we used to pay lease aid as part of building aid, if we paid that to districts on a current basis. I can't recall off the top of my head if we did that or not. So I would say that there's definitely been movement, at least in my tenure, away from current data in every other area. In fact, there's areas like full value where it went from 2-year-old data to 3-year-old data. So there's kind of the opposite tendency, I think, in certain areas.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful. And Jacqueline, do you have any more questions?
No, we're all set.
Okay. All right. I want to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. I found it very instructive and excellent questions. So thank everyone who participated as ASBO members for your participation, and a special thanks to our presenters, Ashley Weil and Andrea Hayari. And we will be posting the recording of this webinar as well as the materials, and you can see their email addresses on the front page, and the email addresses have just been changed at SED, so make note of that, and I'm sure they will be open to follow-up questions that arise from this. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Ashley and Andrea.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Good day.
Bye.